Can we all agree that sometimes life teaches us lessons? Have you ever learned the wrong lesson? I'll give you an example. When I was a kid, I said this last week, we had a fairly narrow diet. One time we had fish that was like fresh fish, and I found a bone in my fish. So what is the reasonable lesson to learn from that? Be careful, right? Don't just go scarfing it down or whatever. The lesson I learned from it was just don't eat fish, ever, right? So I learned a lesson, but it maybe wasn't the right one. Now that's a silly example, but sometimes we learn the wrong lesson, and that wrong lesson is about people, and it impacts people because of the way we then act. Today we encounter a story where Jesus calls Matthew to be a disciple, and then it tells us that he's sitting down at the table and people are coming to him, and those people are tax collectors and sinners. And some of the religious leaders are nearby, and they say, he eats with tax collectors and sinners. Now, here's the thing. There's a lot of movement in the story. If you pay attention to the movement, Jesus didn't go out and get them. Not that he wouldn't, but in this story, he doesn't go find all these people. They come and sit down at the table with him. And then he doesn't tell them to leave, right? So he's having a meal with them, and the religious leaders say, look, he eats with tax collectors and sinners. And when Jesus hears that, he gives them a lesson to learn. He says, look, I did not come for the healthy people, right? The righteous people. I came for the sick people. I came for the sinners so that, right, they could be made whole and well. Now, they may have heard that and thought, yes, we are the people that don't have bones in our fish. We are the righteous people. We are the ones who don't need any help. But still, judging him, right? Because as soon as you think you're in that space, you're going to judge those other people. Now, what's ironic about this story is if you read the rest of the Gospels, who else does Jesus eat with? The religious leaders, right? So sometimes we take what Jesus says and we go, oh, right, he only came to save the sinners. But who are the sinners? Everybody, right? And so if you pay attention to the whole story, when he says to them, I only came for the sinners, not the righteous or whatever, they may have heard, oh, well, that's not us then. Not getting the point that it is them. Now, as he's going through the story, he also tells them what the lesson is. He says, go learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now, we don't live in Jesus' time, so we have to unpack that a little bit. All of our lessons have it today, this idea that God is kind of saying, I don't really need your sacrifices. So if you back up to the Mosaic law, right? Moses goes up on the mountain, comes down with the Ten Commandments, and then there's a whole unpacking of what that means. And those laws included things about what kind of fabrics you could wear and what happens if somebody commits adultery, what kind of food you can eat and not eat, and a whole schedule of when you should offer sacrifices. And so even in the New Testament, when Jesus is born, his parents take him to the temple to offer the sacrifice because that's what you do. Now, in their time, they did not have the separation of church and state like we do. So the law was the law. When Jesus is arrested, he's taken before the council, right? Those were the religious people and the civic leaders, right? It's all one thing. So when Jesus is saying, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, think of sacrifice as being really good church people, right? Following all the rules and doing all the right things. I might, in our day, say it different because that's not how we would connect it. I might say, Jesus is saying, go learn what it means to desire help, not holiness, right? One Wednesday night, we talk about our questions about God on Wednesdays and the world and all kinds of things. And somebody asked a question, they said, what does it mean when somebody says they believe in God and they do all the church things, but then they're mean and terrible people? That's where he said, desire help, not holiness, right? The other way I would say it is Jesus could have said, I desire love, not legality. Because when you're paying attention to all, in their case, the law was the religious law, right? But if you're sticking to the law, but that isn't merciful for people, that's not all that helpful. So the lesson he wants them to learn is I desire mercy, not sacrifice, help, not holiness, love, not legality. And clearly they don't get that lesson because eventually they execute Jesus, right? Put him on the cross. But then, if you pay attention to the story, there's another movement that I never noticed until this week that is fascinating. The religious leaders are standing there over here going, he's eating with the wrong people. And then when we pick the story back up, who comes to him and says, my daughter has died? A religious leader. Now, the story doesn't tell us this, but I'd like to imagine that he was over here going, he's eating with all the wrong people. And then one of his servants comes and says, hey, boss, your daughter died. And in that movement, right, he goes from maybe judging who Jesus is spending time with to being the person that needs mercy, who needs help, who needs love. Not all the holiness and not all the sacrifice and not all the legalities. So he becomes one who comes to Jesus, right? Seeking all of those things that maybe just a few moments before he was judging. So if we fast forward this into our day, right, I think what it calls for us is to have imagination and try to imagine ourselves in the place of other people. Most of us here probably have never been on food stamps or Medicaid, all those kind of public assistance things. Some of us have been. But if you start to have that conversation, right, all the sorts of things come out, right? Some of it's legalities, and we say, well, we shouldn't be doing this, that, or the other. Sometimes we say, well, if you're not going to work, then you shouldn't have to, we shouldn't, the rest of us have to pay taxes. Sometimes you make economic arguments. Sometimes you make, well, if you just give people a handout, they're not going to try. We can go all around that debate in every which kind of way. But then I want you to imagine, if you're retired, that all of a sudden your financial institution that has all of your money collapses and you no longer have anything. And then you say, well, we maybe just ask our kids for help. But imagine that that relationship goes south and all of a sudden you're in a spot where you need help. Do you want people to say, oh, well, you know, if you just would have worked a little harder and been smarter with your investments? Or do you want mercy? Right? Do you want help? Do you want love? Or do you want all those other things? I think the story invites us to imagine that we are on the other side of the line when we might be judging others, when we might be thinking we're holy, and we might be thinking we're righteous, and we might be thinking all these other things, including legalities, and to say, what might it be like if I land on that other side? Years ago, I was in a meeting with pastors, and somebody used this analogy. They said, you know, if there's people like drowning in the river, one thing you can do is stand on the shore and throw them like buoys. And that's how I think about our compassion fund. When people call us and say, hey, we've tried everywhere. Can you help us with our rent? Can you pay for a hotel night because we're homeless? Can you feed us? If we say, sure, and just give them some money or pay for that thing, that's like standing on the riverbank with someone that's drowning and throwing them a buoy. Are they still going to be homeless the next day? Hungry, right? All those things, right? Should we do that? Yes, right? It's mercy, it's help, it's love, but it doesn't solve the long-term problem. So in this meeting that I was in, one of the pastors says, but instead what we should do is get down in the river, right? Well, what does that look like? In the same example, we've had 2 families in the past handful of years that we've gotten out of homelessness. Did we simply write them a check? No. We had to get down into that situation a little bit. One of them, we had a family provide them housing at no cost for a good period of time, right? Something that was a bigger sacrifice than us just giving them some money. Another one, I kept their family's entire worldly possessions in my office for 6 months, and somebody drove them someplace, and we had to get a little bit more involved. Is that risky? Sure it is, right? If you get down in the river, you might end up in the river and needing help yourself. So while we pastors were in this meeting going, well, yes, we should get in the river, and proud of ourselves for our theological thoughts about these things, the bishop at the time happened to be there, and he said, that's all good and well. Who's going up the river to find out why people are in the river? Because it could be that there are some systematic things that could be addressed. It could be that there's some changes that could happen that would keep people from falling into the river in the first place. I've said this before, 70% of the kids in our county don't have enough to eat. Should we feed them? Yes. Should we get deeper into that with them, like getting down the river? Yes. Should we maybe advocate for changes that could keep them from being hungry in the first place? That's where this gets hard. Because if we're in those comfortable spaces where we can kind of hear mercy and not sacrifice, help but not holiness, love but not legalities, if we don't want church to be uncomfortable, then we stop at the riverbank. As soon as you get in the river, it starts getting risky. But if you're going to go up the riverbank, it gets into a whole different space. We had our Senate Assembly for the last 3 days, and I'm exhausted. And part of the reason I'm exhausted is that I was in a handful of conversations outside the main meeting where some of those people that need help and mercy and love because our systems of the church don't work for them were crying out in their need. The systems work for me, right? So I had to listen to that and hear that and wonder how we might do things to change that. And what happens if you start to do things to change that? You end up with some people going, who do you think you're eating with over there? Right? And you end up in some of those uncomfortable spaces. We had another bishop come to the seminary and I was there and say that a peaceful church is not a faithful church. And so if we're going to address some of those deeper things, which sometimes is law, as we are here on the anniversary of Pulse, right, I would love to tell you that we've made a great deal of progress in our culture at being more open and welcoming of LGBTQ people, but we have a law now in this state that prevents transgender youth from getting gender-affirming health care. That's a complicated thing, but that doesn't seem like mercy or help or love to me, but it is a legality. And for us to say, well, maybe we should do something about that, would mean doing some things that we don't generally think of as the church's work. And it might mean we have to disagree a little bit. One of those meetings I was in, conversations that were hard, ended up with some pretty heated emotions. But later in the week, the same people came back together and used the tools we have as the church, confession, forgiveness, right, to build some reconciliation, to continue to hang in together in those spaces. The same Jesus that says he desires mercy, not sacrifice, help, not holiness, love, not legalities. Did he experience mercy as he was taken to the cross? No. Help? Love? All of that was left behind, and yet it's in that space that he meets us in all the places that we fail to do those same things. Saturday night, I was blessed to have dinner with Pastor Nicole and the pastors that she serves with and the deacon she serves with and some people from their congregation. And some of you know this, but when I order at restaurants, I often just say, surprise me, because I just don't have enough energy to read menus. And so the server said, do you prefer like seafood or not seafood or something? And I said, I do have a preference, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. And you all now know that preference is what? Not seafood. And she said, well, this game is fun. What do you suppose she surprised me with? Chilean sea bass. It was fantastic. Right? Because I was willing to say surprise me with food, I got surprised and it was amazing. Last night, we had fish at home that was courtesy of Ian Eastwood, the fisherman. And some of it had bones in it. Was it still good? It was, right? That wrong lesson I learned a long time ago has been righted. But the other thing about it is, hanging in there in that space, grace will surprise us. It may be hard to live in the spaces of help and mercy and love, but Jesus was died and raised for which people? All of them, right? And so when we live in those spaces, we find that that gift that we have of life in Jesus shows us again and again and again that there is a wideness in God's mercy. Amen.